All right. So I've had a conversation recently with a student at school. So a little bit of background. I am doing a master's degree in computer science at the University of Chicago. I'm also a teaching assistant for a class called the Data Science Clinic, where students work in small teams on like real world projects, right? So the students, like I'm working on a project that is in association with Fermilab, which is like a nationally funded like physics laboratory outside of Chicago, and they're working on neutrino detection to sort of like hopefully better understand the like fundamental physics that makes up our world. And they have like a data science project associated with sort of like filtering the data that comes in through this neutrino detector. So this is like an example of the kind of project that students are doing. And at the in the clinic, the students do a mid-quarter presentation on their projects, right? So they get up in front of all the other students in the class and they say, hey, listen, like here's what we're working on, here's the problem, here's the progress we've made, et cetera. And so after the mid-quarter presentation a week or so ago, I ended up running into one of the students who presented in the like food court area, right? So I was like, hey, like good presentation, it was interesting stuff, whatever. And we ended up talking a little bit. And it came out that I own a gym, right, and that I'm involved in fitness and stuff like that. And so, in the context of a university environment with like analytical people working on data science and stuff like that, it's like pretty interesting to be like, oh, like this person is into fitness and knows that sort of about that sort of thing. And so, he ended up asking me like, hey, can I ask you some questions about fitness? I've been starting to work out. I'm just curious, like what's going on and if I'm like potentially doing some stuff wrong. And I was like, absolutely, like happy to help, give me the rundown. And so he gave me a little bit of a breakdown of his training routine, which was pretty aggressive. Like he was doing double sessions. He was going in the morning and doing Stairmaster for a while, going in the evening and doing some sort of weight training routine. And it was like, am I overtraining? Is this okay? This, that, whatever. And, as we've sort of talked about, and I think anyone who's a coach knows, when people start asking you questions about their specific routine, all that stuff, you kind of want to get some context. You're like, hey, like, what are you actually trying to do? Are you trying to look good, feel good? Are you trying to, achieve some sort of specific goal? Like, is this the first time you've been training? Just give me like a little bit of a rundown of what's going on. And so he's like, oh, okay, yeah. Well, so actually, I'm not necessarily training for aesthetics or like health or longevity or anything like that. Like I'm training because I want to do parkour. And I was like, oh, okay. Like, have you done parkour before? And he's like, no. And I was like, oh, well, all right. So like, what's the deal? So you're hoping that you just like work out and then like eventually you're going to do parkour, or like, can you just give me a little bit more information? And he was like, well, I've never really done anything before. Like I don't have an athletic background. I'm not athletic at all. And I watch these parkour videos and the people in them are like super athletic. So I feel like I need to work out and become more athletic in order to be able to do parkour. And, I think that, I was at first like, okay, well, like, I understand what you're saying, and I'm not opposed to you working out. Like, that's a good idea. But at the same time, if you want to do parkour, like, you should definitely just do parkour, right? I mean, you're doing double sessions, 6 days a week. You're working out, 12-ish times a week, potentially hours a day. If you just did parkour for a few of those sessions, within a few months, you would be just like doing parkour rather than working out for potentially another year or something and then starting parkour. Like, why not just start right now and, like accelerate that curve? And he just kind of like, and not to make fun of him at all, right? Because he's a young kid who's like excited about this, but he just sort of like paused for kind of a while and you could see the wheels turning. And he's just like, I never thought of it that way. And like, that's a little bit funny, right? But at the same time, it's like, I think actually pretty insightful, where especially the sort of, thoughtful, analytical kind of person who would potentially be involved in something like the data science clinic, who would probably listen to a podcast like this, like a pretty classic failure mode is to overanalyze something that you want to do, come up with some sort of plan of how to get there in some sort of like step-by-step way, and then just try to like execute on this plan without actually thinking about like, okay, is the most important thing for me to do to execute on my plan, or is the most important thing for me to do to try to do the thing that I want to do, make contact with reality, and like recognize where I potentially need to improve, or just like through the contact with reality, like that is actually how I'm improving, right? Like it seems sort of obvious that no amount of Stairmaster is going to make you good at parkour, right? To the people who listen to a podcast like this. But I think we see a lot of the same failure modes in CrossFit stuff where it's like, okay, I'm going to do this many, seated external rotations, this many band pull aparts, and then I'm going to be able to do muscle ups. And it's like, well, maybe, but like, I don't think that that's actually going to be the thing that gets you there. So yeah, I know we've talked about this before, but I kind of wanted to use that story as like a jumping off point to discuss this idea of like, hey, like do the actual thing, that's going to be the most important thing to move you forward, especially if you have a goal of, doing a specific movement, doing a CrossFit competition, competing in some other sport, learning to do parkour, whatever, like just, start doing the thing, right?
Yeah, I think we mention often, and I suppose if I think about like what we used to say on earlier podcasts, we were talking about training progressions and how to build an aerobic base and all of this type of stuff. And I think that how long have we been doing the podcast? 5 years, something like that. I think like over that time, like I think the general consensus within CrossFit is that very that sort of that more that approach, which is a little bit more measured, and you're taking into considerations the sort of the pieces of the puzzle. That's important, but you also have to practice competing. You also have to get a lot of exposures to the sport, and you need to go through sort of that very like that trial and error iteration on a weekly basis. And you could do that through throwdown workouts or whatever it is. For me personally, I've definitely moved a lot more towards that managing the chaos style of coaching, rather than everything sort of like having to be sort of super broken down. And I suppose that a lot of the people we tend to work with who do remote coaching, they sort of expect things to be really broken down. And I think some people can get caught up in that type of training a bit too much. And it's almost like they're trying to take the approach that you take maybe when you're far away from competition and you're in your quote unquote off season. And then they try to bring that into a sport, which requires you to just practice it a lot. Otherwise, you end up sort of losing that sharpness for the sport. And rowing intervals are a lot are very different to doing a high turnover workout with rowing involved.
Yeah, I think there's also an element, not just of like, oh, I want to do off-season style training and like break everything down, but this idea of I know I'm not where I need to be, so I need to like do this other stuff to get to this threshold before I can then do the thing that I want to do. Right. And that with competitions, that's like a pretty salient example of that within the sort of like competitive CrossFit community, where it's like, oh, well, I can't yet do a muscle up, or I can't yet do this workout in this time. And I know these people are all better than me. So I need to, sort of like go out in the barn and like work out for a certain amount of time before I can even take that step to do this thing. And I think that's counterproductive for a lot of people who are serious about wanting to do the thing, right? It's like, yeah, you look like you're saying you have to actually compete in order to build the skill of competing and like figure out what's going on. And that no amount of rowing progression and band pull aparts and all that stuff is going to like substitute for that experience.
Yeah, something I I get a lot when I'm coaching, just in class, is people who are looking for that like secret tip on how to do something. It's like, yeah, how do I get better at jump rope? Like, what am I doing wrong? And I watch them, I'm like, you're fine, but sorry, my Google just picked up that I was talking. I was not happy. That their technique is fine and everything, but they just haven't done jump rope enough. It's like, yeah, you just need to practice. Like, come in before class, 5 minutes every time you come in, and just practice double unders. You'll fail a bunch. That's okay. Just keep practicing. And you just need to actually do it just to get a feel for it and to understand how the movement works. And, I think we're in that kind of time in society, and I'm not going to get too deep here, but, there's so much information and knowledge that's like easily accessible to people. And it's like, hey, how do I do this? I'm going to go on YouTube. I'm going to watch a video. I'm going to know how to do it. And people have that mindset of, okay, if I can just find the one thing that's holding me back here, I'm going to be able to crush this. And it's like, yeah, I mean, sometimes that works, but other times it's you just need to practice it, and you just need to do multiple reps and keep going and keep practicing and keep working on it. There's not always that magic fix that's going to make everything a whole lot easier.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. Oh, go ahead, Luke. Sorry.
Yeah. Like another thing that's interesting is how, like as you said, we have access to so much more information about how to approach things that, a lot of the time people end up actually just, they focus too much on what they're doing, on how they should be going about it, and actually not just like doing the thing. And I suppose it's sort of, the example you hear of in business all the time is like, you need to be able to like fail fast and, don't try to perfect things, and just get busy and just do the thing and go through it that way. And I think that you obviously need to like take on a bit of both, but you can imagine like the business person that sort of just like opens up businesses and it's messy and they try lots of things and they fail with lots of things, and then eventually it sort of comes together in its own little way because they just like pick up all these little experiences and they learn through that process. Whereas you might have someone who might be a little bit overly analytical and they start chasing metrics that don't really mean much. They start going through trying to optimize this part of the business or that part of the business, and it doesn't really work that way because they end up having a bit of a loss of connection with, say, the real world. And I suppose the equivalent of that in CrossFit is going to be someone who doesn't have that connection to the sport, and they're just trying to progress their EMOMs in a certain way, or they're trying to progress their aerobic time trials in a way which is apparently going to come together for when they do a competition. But that's just one movement that might come up out of 25 movements in a weekend of competition, and then they might not even have there's lots of different contexts and situations that they need to be able to practice and be adaptable with as well. And I suppose the people who do really well in competitions, those people who have just got enough training experiences to understand how workouts are going to be, and they can actually sort of like have a good idea of what's going on, but they also have enough experience where they've had to change a plan, or they've had to figure it out on the spot and all of that business. And that is actually is super important. And I think training in a super structured way is going to distract from those experiences where you are figuring things out as you go along and that type of thing.
Yeah, Luke, I think the idea of like failing fast is really important and salient here, right? I mean, obviously, like working out and trying to do a CrossFit competition is pretty different in a lot of ways than the sort of like business setting that you're talking about. But I think that that's like a good example to give like one of the like seeming paradoxes or dichotomies of this kind of thought process, right? Where it's like you want to have a plan, but you want to recognize as quickly as possible that your plan is bad, right? So it's like, okay, I have this plan for how I'm going to approach training. I want to be able to do a competition at this level. I know I'm below where I need to be. And then like, sort of like we're saying, some people will have that plan. It involves a lot of them like isolating themselves and just like trying to do, some sort of like training montage for X amount of time. And then suddenly they show up and they just like win their first competition or whatever, right? But the better strategy, sort of like you're saying, is have a plan, but assume that it's bad, right? It's better than nothing, but this is a bad plan. And then do something as quickly as possible to figure out why your plan is bad and fix it, right? It's like, okay, my plan sucks, but I don't know why it sucks. Like, I know parts of it are good. I know parts of it are bad. I don't know which one is which. How do I figure out which parts of this plan are bad? Oh, well, I do something like as soon as it makes sense in the context of my plan to test how my plan is going, and then I adjust. And so that adjustment is what actually I think gives people the most improvement. And sort of like you're saying, in a business context, especially if you're trying to develop a new product or something, like you need to have contact with the market as soon as possible. You need to try offering the thing and see if anyone wants it. And if they don't, you're like, okay, like my thing clearly like sucks in some way. Like maybe the thing sucks, maybe I'm not good at explaining it, maybe I'm talking to the wrong people, but I need to know that rather than going off and building this product for 2 years that no one likes. If I can find that out, if I can get something in, a month and a half and no one wants it, then I can maybe fix it. And if I do that every month and a half for 2 years, I'm potentially in a better spot than if I just made something for 2 years that's bad,
I think specifically within CrossFit as well, you find people that they're the kind of people that have to work at everything. Nothing comes naturally to them. Nothing comes easy. And it's kind of going back to what you were saying, Luke, about the people that initially started doing CrossFit were just kind of already fit people that were looking for another outlet. I think, you see it if a new skill comes up. So I watched people in our gym after the games last year looking at like crossover double unders. First time they'd really been out there as a movement within CrossFit when they came up at the games. And there are some people who, a couple of failed reps and all of a sudden they've got it. They know what they're doing. They have that kind of awareness and innate athletic ability to pick up these skills. And then you watch other people I saw some people who are really good in CrossFit, like really good CrossFit athletes, and just struggle and could not pick up the skill. They couldn't find a way to figure out how to do it. When it's something which on the surface is relatively basic. Like, I'm not saying it's an easy movement, but it's not this like high complex skill with lots of moving parts and lots of variables. It's knowing how to control your hands with your jump rope and having that awareness of where your hands are in relation to the rest of your body. And I think some people just have a difficult time actually learning skills and perfecting skills because they don't have enough, their proprioception and their body awareness and their just general athleticism isn't there. So I think for a lot of people, the stages of improving things look different. So going back to your original guy that you were talking about, Todd, for someone like him, he could find that just doing parkour, he just picks it up quickly and he has kind of an understanding. He's watched it enough to know what it should look like, to know kind of what the body shapes are going to look like and be able to feel that out. Or he could be on the other end of the scale where it's like in his head, he knows what he should be doing, but has no ability to make his body do that. And I think that's pretty common to have both ends of the spectrum within CrossFit. And it doesn't necessarily limit your potential as in like athletic potential, but it does change the journey of how you get to that point.
Yeah, so that's interesting you say that because I'm listening to an audiobook at the moment. It's I forget. It's about skill development. It's by a guy called Rob Gray. Really interesting, and he's sort of going into a lot of the ideas around constraints-based learning. And one of the things he was talking about was when you are learning a skill, essentially like a closed loop skill. A lot of the skills that we find in CrossFit, I think people with this fairly analytical approach to things, they want to find like the perfect way to do it. And when you are performing a movement, it's not necessarily about performing the same perfect movement continuously, but it's about sort of finding or performing the movement within basically the boundaries of what is a good rep or a bad rep, and it's basically trying to build build that experience where you're figuring it out, and you're not necessarily trying to hit like the movement perfect every single time, but you are trying to hit the movement sort of successfully every time. But yeah, you're figuring out like what is the boundary of like me being able to do this and me not being able to do this. And when you are, say, practicing something, like if you say 10 minutes, work on your muscle ups, figure it out, or not like figure it out, like here's a few ideas of things you can work on. A lot of people are fairly resistant to that, and they want to have an EMOM of list, very specific drill to do. And it's sort of like, it doesn't work like that. You actually need to be able to figure out, okay, if I use my kip a little bit too much, I overshoot it a little bit. If I don't do it enough, I'm sort of grinding the rep out. But you're figuring it out, and you're figuring out where that boundary is. And then when you know that where that boundary is, that's going to help you. And it's very important, especially in CrossFit, because it's like you do this stuff under fatigue. CrossFit is an endurance sport, but you have skill and strength prerequisites. As soon as you're able to do something, now you've got to do it a lot of them, or you've got to do it harder, and you've got to do it under very fatigued situations. So you're not going to be able to replicate that perfect situation that you want to be able to practice in training.
Yeah, Luke, I think that's like a super insightful framing of not trying to do things perfectly, but trying to find like the boundaries or whatever, if that's the right phrase. Because I think that applies very well to this like sort of narrow skill acquisition setup of like, oh yeah, I want to be better at muscle ups. Like, where are the boundaries of this movement? And can I sort of like iteratively get myself to a spot where I'm consistent in terms of my ability to execute. And then I also sort of have like a framework for how I need to do things in different scenarios and like where things are going to fall apart. Like, yes, absolutely makes sense with like the narrow skill of the muscle up. Now, if we kind of zoom out to the idea of like, I would like to someday do parkour, or I would like to someday do a CrossFit competition, or I would someday like to, level up in terms of the athletes who I'm competing against. I think you can think of that the same way, where you're like, okay, yeah, you need to find the boundaries of where you're at, like with this skill as a whole, or this like framework as a whole. And the best way to do that is sort of like we've been saying, is to try the activity and sort of see where you sit, right? Because by trying the activity, you feel the boundaries of where you are with this idea of like doing parkour in general, or doing a CrossFit competition in general. And then once you sort of know where those are, just like you would on a muscle up, where you're like, oh yeah, I overshot on that one, or like, oh, my kip like put me too far back and I had to do some weird thing to try to get over the bar. With a sort of like a zoomed out idea where it's like, okay, I'm going to do a competition someday, and then you do one and you're like, oh, actually, I did much better than I thought on XYZ, but like I can't do handstand push-ups to a normal competition standard because I just like do them on my own and I do them wrong all the time. And you're like, I can fix that. Like, so you're feeling out where these boundaries are and then fixing them. And so I think that that's a really good way of framing it.
Yeah, no, like I think you can obviously think about this in a number of different ways. It's sort of like I think of sort of where I've gone through in my own coaching, and I've definitely tried to create the perfect 6-week peaking cycle for someone to go into competition, and giving them experiences that are positive and all this business. But to be honest with you, just getting people to like practice and play the sport and do that is probably going to put them in a situation where they're more prepared for the competition, because you can get all your energy systems in the right spot and all of this type of stuff like going for you. But at the end of the day, when you are in competition, especially for someone who's like fairly experienced, it's about, yeah, like we're saying, it's about figuring out where the boundaries are of your abilities, and sort of matching that, and sort of staying within that, so that you can put out your best performance and you can do the best you can in the competition. And if you don't really have those experiences in training where you are really pushing it, and you might fail, or you might actually just push it a little bit too much, like without those experiences, it can be really difficult to sort of know where you are. And that's probably why you get people who compete a lot and do lots of competitions. And I remember like I'd look at people and I'd be like, they compete too much, or whatever it was. And they're not sort of going through your more traditional periodized training plan or whatever it is. But they actually end up just like figuring it out and doing it pretty well because they just know what they're able to do, and they know what they're capable of doing, and they've practiced that sort of improvisation enough to the point where they're able to perform and do well on game day.